and then it started, and then yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it says, okay, good, we're up now. All right, Karin, thank you very much. It's wonderful that you will join me, that is to say, on Good Friday, which in Germany is called Karl-Freitag.
Karl-Freitag, yes.
Yeah, maybe at some point during your talk you can actually explain why it's called Karl-Freitag. I still have no idea, but you are not only...
I'm sorry, I've forgotten too, so let's drop that.
Let's avoid it then, okay. But yeah, not only have you come to join me on Good Friday, but you're also fighting your allergies. Yeah, I mean, that's just typical of the person that you are, ever the fighter. So yeah, today we're going to talk about an interesting passage which takes you to the United Kingdom, a place which I know very well and hold very dear to me as well. The jump from Cincinnati to the UK, was it direct or via Germany?
It was direct. Somebody came through the Goethe Institute to hold lectures in America, and after he had gone back to London, I was bombarded with letters and so on and so forth. I wanted during my vacation to go to Germany, and first stop over in England, which I did, and I stayed in England, and I only went back to America to tell them I'm leaving and I'm going to get married again. That was a decision that was very rash, and it was something that I, in the end, may have regretted, but I don't really, because that period of my life was strenuous. It was in part terrible, in part traumatic, but at the same time, it proved me that I could survive.
Under adverse conditions, basically.
Yes. Excuse me. Okay, I hope my voice holds a bit better now.
Yeah, me too. Okay, wow. So, yeah, quick decisions are not always traumatic, but unfortunately they do occasionally turn out to be that way. So, but you made a big change. I mean, moving, if you had moved back to Germany, then it would have been far easier for you to accomplish. But you not only decided to leave Cincinnati, which is a place you had established yourself after your first husband passed away, you fought on, but then you decided to continue the fight in a completely different country, even though you'd had a pleasant experience just after the war in the UK. But this is, I believe, a completely different part of the country, wasn't it, that you would be going to?
It was London.
Yeah.
We were staying in London. The thing was that I decided, when I realized what was happening in and around us, I remembered my mother saying, once you have said yes, you stick with it no matter. So this is why I kept on in Britain for almost 15 years. But that period of my life was, in a way, I can encapsulate that by saying I was not free to lead my own life. I had little chance of making decisions in and around my life, except I was responsible for everything. I was responsible for the nitty-gritty. I was responsible for the atmosphere. I was responsible for the weather. I was responsible for reality. And that responsibility, I later discovered, was something I could be manipulated by. And that period in London was pure manipulation of my sense of responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but you've never claimed to be able to control the weather, have you, to my knowledge? And if you did, then I think you'd control it in a far better way.
No, I couldn't, and I couldn't control many of the other things as well. But it was pushed over to Karin will take care of it.
So you did all of the hard work, but the shine and the plaudits not so, if I understand correctly. Just to sum things up, and then we can move on, because you also, from what you've said, you still did a lot of talks. You worked on lots of interesting projects, as in your output didn't really go down, did it?
No, it didn't go down. It first of all, it was, as in Cincinnati, it was a 100-hour work week. I was in charge of the house. I was in charge of editing every word that he wrote, and then trying to find little corners where I could do my own things. If they were out of his sphere, he would interfere. If they were in one way or another connected with his sphere or came in handy with his pursuits, I was allowed to do them. So I did as much as I can, and I'm going to go into it a little more a little later. Mm-hmm. I realized once I came to England that I wasn't really going to be living in England. I was going to live in a German exile surrounding, and not having television, not having access to a lot of English people, to be confined, not to have newspapers, and so on and so forth. I wasn't used to having these restrictions all over me. So in one way or another, I, in the beginning, fought against them, but I saw that fighting did nothing to alleviate the burden. So I started to find ways of doing other things. But first, this realization was particularly coming up when there was a scholarship for my partner to the Villa Massimo in Rome, which was the first year I was in Britain. We stayed in Rome at the Villa Massimo for half a year. And again, as in Britain, we weren't living in Rome. We weren't living within Italian surrounding. We were living among German artists who had scholarships to this foundation. And it was living among artists is hard enough at times. And at the same time, I took everything I could out of this experience and made the best of it. Coming back to London, I had the privilege of meeting somebody from the German embassy, and the person was interested in literature and asked me whether I would travel around England and give lectures on literary subjects like Brecht or Goethe or whatever they wanted in German English societies or in universities or whatever. So I traveled around to Cheltenham, to Salisbury, to York, and gave these lectures, and there were some wonderful, funny experiences, because in Salisbury, the group that had invited me was a German-English society run by ex-military people who had been to Germany and had married in Germany and brought their German wives. And they wanted to talk about a comparison between Goethe and somebody else, I don't remember. Anyway, I had all kinds. I usually make several levels of papers, because you never know who your listeners are. So in that case, I went and dropped everything I'd done and simply started telling them about what I was going to say in a most academic way, telling them about the literature, what it meant, what it said. And I thought it was like giving a lecture to 15-year-olds. At the end of it, they were already tearing their raffle tickets apart because there would be a raffle afterwards. And once the chair of the German English Society or English-German, Anglo-German Society looked at his wife and said, dear, you wanted culture, you got it. At which point I couldn't burst out laughing, but I laughed a lot afterwards. But those were, of course, very human and very lovely experiences. These papers brought me out, got me in touch with English society, at least to some degree. A little better it did become when I was starting to write feuilletons for the East German magazine. They wanted papers on English literary landscapes. So I had to go out and research Lady Chatterley country, Sherlock Holmes London, the Robin Hood country, which led me all through Northern England. And then I wrote my feuilletons, and they were published. And that, of course, in most cases, let me go out on my own. Because if and when my husband would have come along, he took over the interview, and it was the time was shot. So I was very lucky when I could go alone, and I did, and it kept me in balance to some degree. The other thing that kept me relatively in balance was that we had to travel a lot on his behalf for business, for literary business. We were in Germany 6-7 times a year, and not just for business, but also to visit our families, and particularly when there was an emergency in one of our families, I got in the car and drove to Germany and stayed there for a week or two or whatever. And that gave me time to be myself. And that was made it a little easier. In London, there were, of course, quite a number of things that I could do there, because there was the connection between Penn and the Club 43. I'll talk about Penn later. The Club 43 was a culture club that had divided from the Kulturbund, which was leftist, and the bourgeois elements had formed their own culture club in 1943, and this is why the club was called 1943. It still existed. It existed into the 20th century, in the 21st century, and it involved Monday lectures on anything and everything that might be of interest to people who had the exile experience internalized and lived in England. So I gave a lot of lectures there. My partner had done the same. So that was allowed, and that was very, very important, because it stressed something that had been with me from the beginning when I started researching National Socialism throughout America, where I also was living in part with German exiles, and through courses I'd taken at the University of Cincinnati on exile literature. So exile literature had been part of my life since then. And in America too, we had in Kentucky an exile literature conference every year, which I attended. And so it was a lifeline in London to be able to continue work on literary exile and work with people who had been exiled from the Nazis. And then came another string that tied me to exile, was the Pen of German-speaking writers abroad. PEN is an organization, a worldwide organization of writers. It has centers in many, many countries, and because of the political upheavals of the 20th century, the German PEN left the PEN family at Ragusa, which is Dubrovnik today, because there was Widerstand. There were talks against them. They were called to task. The German Nazis who had taken over German PEN were called to task by German exile writers, and they left the room, left PEN, and a year later the German PEN in exile was born. It was born in England. There was an English secretary who lived in England. There was Heinrich Mann, who lived in France, who was the president. And already in the first or second years, there were some 25 exile writers from all over the world, part of this exile PEN. And this exile PEN survived in a way beyond 1948. In 48, they renamed themselves as PEN of German-speaking writers abroad, because in 48, German PEN re-established itself in two parts, East and West, which later split into East German PEN, West German PEN, and the exile PEN in London, called German-speaking writers abroad now. This group was in London. My partner became secretary of the center, and I became the secretary, and much later the treasurer of the group. And this was a new push into the problem of exile and the understanding of what exile meant physically, mentally, emotionally, and across generations. So it stayed with me, and it stays with me today. So in that sense, the London experience gave me something very important. You see, when family matters took me to Germany, many times I went alone because I was the chauffeur. I could go alone. He had to go by train or by boat. He very rarely went alone. He was also already, I'm sorry. He every time he went, he needed a chauffeur. So when I was called because of cases of need, because of illness, I went alone by car to Germany, and in many cases it was for a week here, 2 weeks there, to help his parents. Or when my father was in hospital in Tübingen, I was allowed to stay for 3 months with him or near him. And also when my niece became ill, I simply jumped into the car and could go. And all these experiences in Germany alone helped me balance myself, I must say, although they were very traumatic. The PEN connection did not just strengthen my involvement in exile, it also gave me cause for writing, for speaking, because we had the 50th anniversary of that PEN Center, which had been born in 1934, was celebrated in London with a literary event to which quite a number of renowned people came. I was involved in the management of it. In the year later, we had the next year we were in New York and had an event there with the American members of that Penn Center. This Penn Center, by the way, had some 117 members in 17 countries, so it was quite worldwide. And the event in New York gave me the privilege of giving a talk on American exile under the title of Was America Second Home or Second Foreign Country? And that, of course, plays into the experience of, do you feel at home in your new country? Can you ever make it your home, literally, language-wise, emotionally? Or are you losing both after a while when you cannot really get in touch with your own country anymore, emotionally, through language, through communication, as was the case during the Nazi period? They couldn't just pick up the phone and Skype to back to Germany, to their publisher or to their friends or to their family. They were really cut off.
Okay, so Penn was set up in 1934. Obviously,
German Penn in Exile.
Yeah, German Penn in Exile. Okay, so
Yes.
Obviously Hitler came to power in 1933. So therefore, this network began to increase when people decided that they could not, in any way, continue to live under Nazi rule. So therefore, they left. Either they were forced to leave or they left of their own volition, and obviously became or joined up with Penn in Exile. But when was Penn actually set up? Was it an organization specifically for Germans, or was it?
No, for writers worldwide. It was set up in England in 1921 by a woman, and it was a writers' club in the beginning, at first in England, and then there came a French and an American and a Canadian, and there were a number of foundations of national pen clubs. And the national pen clubs joined under the umbrella International Pen. So by the time the first Exile Pen Center, which was this German writers group, came in, they had something like 60, maybe 50 pen centers around the world. In the end, we had, or when I left my job in the 2006, we had 170 member centers of International Pen. Of course, because it was a writers' organization, it did not have the amount of members that, for instance, later Amnesty had. Penn had something like 15,000 members throughout the world. And when in the 60s, the Commonwealth and the colonialism effects went to pieces, and the former colonies became independent, there was a big increase in attacks on writers, because anybody who speaks freely is also speaking freely on corruption, on lack of freedom, and so on and so forth. So this is when, in the pen community, they decided to have a writers in prison committee, which meant a committee that wasn't just for writers in prison, but writers before prison, meaning persecuted writers. And they set up ways and means of helping them in writers in prison committees in individual pens. And this was in 1961, in the beginning of 61. And in the fall of 61, amnesty was established, basically along the same lines, except it was not limited to writers. And many of our writers were co-founders of amnesty centers in different countries. So there was a close connection in terms of contents and in terms of personnel.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, though, isn't it? I mean, we're going to talk about PEN a lot more in future sessions. So, I mean, maybe I could hold off my question about it, but it's just a very small curiosity, which we could, further develop down the line. But PEN doesn't have the same reputation that amnesty has, and I don't mean that PEN has a bad reputation. I just mean that it's not as well known as amnesty.
Because it's writers only, and amnesty is for everybody, which means it has so many volunteers. It has so many people who work for amnesty. It is a huge organization, particularly if you compare it with PEN. And in PEN, you cannot, for instance, join PEN. You have to be asked to join it, and you have to be voted in, meaning it's a selective group, which is getting better, I must say. It's getting more democratic. But it was a matter of size also. Plus, PEN, of course, has literary concerns beyond writers in prison. It has now also different committees, more after writers in prison. The women's writers was established in the late 80s, early 90s, and I was a co-founder of that center, of that committee. In the 90s, end of 90s, we established a Writers in Exile network across the PEN centers. It did not become a committee, because a committee would have had to be centered in London with International PEN. The network was independent groups who were dealing with writers in exile and helping them in countries like Canada and the United States, in the Scandinavian countries, in Germany, in Austria, and so on. And there was one more committee, which was the linguistic committee, which dealt with minority languages and translations. And that is the smallest one of the committees, and it was always centered either in Macedonia, now Northern Macedonia, or in Spain, because they were mostly dealing with different languages in their own realm. And they were trying to balance the language problem and the translation problem. And minor languages had little chance of being translated around the world, so they needed a special effort. And unfortunately, the big centers, very few of the big centers really participated in the Translation and Literary Rights Committee. Most centers. We had 115 centers with writers in prison committees, which of course was wonderful.
Was that the biggest committee then?
Yes, it was. It was. And then again, it was not, it didn't have that many people. We had to activate members in our centers to participate in writing letters to officials or regimes or to our politicians to help alleviate the burden of repression in other countries. Some pen centers had committees. The Canadians had a committee of 100, plus they activated the wider public. German pen, for instance, didn't have a committee. They had one representative for writers in prison, and he or she had to do everything, build their own background committee or helpers. They were supported in a way by the German managers who did some of the writing. All the rest had to be done by the representative of the Writers in Prison Committee, who was also the vice president of German Pen. So it was a very mixed bag of influences, membership, strength. The African countries sometimes had 20 members, and maybe they had one person interested or free to work in terms of writers in prison, and then it was mostly for writers in prison in their own country. And we, on the outside, tried to help as much as we could.
All right, thank you. Yeah, sorry I interrupted your train of thought there. It was just it's important to get some background as to pen, even though obviously this information is out there online. But I think it's enhanced a little bit to get your tell on how it was and how things developed and grew and so on.
I will probably refer back to it when I come back in my tale to Germany, where my involvement in international German pen and international pen became extreme and very rewarding. And then I'll go into the structure a bit more.
Sure. Okay. So, if just to catch up back where we were, then you'd come back to Germany. You'd driven back. Your partner had, on occasion, when he had also travelled, come by train, because he also always needed to be driven about. But there were many occasions where you came back alone, and these were opportunities for you to collect yourself, as it were, to balance out the imbalances that had developed, and then you sort of plunged back into things when you returned to the UK.
Yes.
Okay.
I think I was in a movie theater in London once. I saw 2 plays. I did get to know London fairly well because I had, of course, to drive our guests through London. So I found my way around, and I was lucky. At that time, there was no charge yet to get into the city of London. And I had the good luck of always finding a parking space. So I drove around London quite a bit, saw it, but I didn't get into the inside of London. I didn't get to meet very many people and or see their homes or exchange ideas with them. That I missed very much. And I was lucky that I had it half a lifetime before that I knew something about English life or British life. And so it wasn't all lost on that front either.
This is for you're going back to your experiences in Northumberland.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I can't. The only thing that's completely unbelievable about your story is that you could always find parking spaces in London. But I mean, that's a different.
Yes, I was lucky. I had a nose. I drove back and forth to the airport, I drove through the center of London, the center of Westminster, the center of the city of London, and somehow I always found parking space within walking distance.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I believe you because it's you. I believe you because it's you. But having grown up in London, I was born in London, and yeah, I mean, I used to spend hours driving around trying to find parking space.
Yeah.
So yeah, you had more than a nose for it. I think you had some kind of GPS, strategy sensor or whatever that somehow took you to where you needed to be.
On the contrary, when I came to Cologne, I spent sometimes a half an hour driving around the place I lived to find a parking space. I got it back when I came to Cologne, so I wasn't lucky all the time.
Okay, all right. That's in some ways I'd say that's a relief. In other ways, it's a shame, really, because Cologne is a little bit smaller than London. But so that's a different issue. Okay, so yes. So, I mean, but also you were brave to drive around London. I mean, I have to admit, when I was driving around London in my 20s, I hated it because everybody's just crazy in a big city, the way they drive. It's almost like, well, it's not quite as bad as Athens or Rome, but I mean, it's still crazy the way people drive.
You're saying it. I learned danger driving in Rome.
You drove in Rome?
I love to drive. I started driving when I was 18. I drove in Germany. I drove in America. Wherever I went, I drove. England was no problem. I within seconds got into the flow of driving on the left-hand side. I had a German car where the steering wheel was on the left side. So I didn't have to adjust to all the changes, just to driving on the left-hand side of the road, which posed no problem, and it didn't pose any problem to go back and forth to the continent and switching from the left to the right. But Italy was a challenge. I remember driving into Rome, not knowing anything about the way that they had service roads next to the main roads, and that you had to get into the service roads to be able to turn right or left. That on the main throughways you were stuck, and if you didn't get the right turnoff into the service road, which didn't seem like a road, you had lost it. Plus, when you were driving and since nobody looked at the lights, you had to test whether you had stronger nerves or the others. You drove just to the point where either they backed up or you backed up. And when you didn't back up, they let you through, and they weren't mad or anything. That was part of the game. The only rule in Italy that they all abided by was don't cause an accident.
That's a nice one, I have to admit. They should have that rule everywhere. Absolutely. To save so many people's lives. But yeah, I never drove in Rome. I wouldn't drive in Rome, Karin. That explains our levels of bravery and where they are on the bravery monitor. For me, it was scary enough just to ride a bus in Rome. And that'll do the job for me, I think. But a lovely city. I don't think anybody can complain about that. But anyway, okay, cool. So you're back in London. You're back driving people around the town. You are giving lectures on German culture. You are engaging with people on an intellectual basis. It's satisfying your intellectual needs.
Yes, in one part. It got a bit more difficult when writing. If I wrote, or if I researched or wrote anything that was outside of the line of our lives, I was being basically harassed not to keep the attention away from our life. And then there were these projects where we wrote together, basically two projects. One project, a book in English on the Palatinate, where he came from, which in the end I had to write because I'd only gotten little bits of information and he had left for Germany, so I wrote the book. I don't think he ever read it. And he never even read one chapter of the English version of our Berlin book. We researched in Berlin, East and West, for a book, Two Cities Under Seven Flags, was the English title. We had the same in German. He was in charge of the German version. I was in charge of the English version, which was an American English version because it was a big city, in a big city context. The thing was that whenever he had changed something, I had to research. So it got very difficult in terms of working together. It wasn't working together. It was sometimes working against one another. And the other thing I did research and write or edit was a book on biobibliographies of the members of German-speaking writers abroad. This Penn Center, of course, was still based in London. We had conferences or membership meetings of 10, 15 people, no more. And since I had gotten to know many of them, and one of the loveliest people I met, the former secretary of the Penn Center, Gabriele Tergit, who came from Berlin. She was famous in Berlin at the time. She had started biobibliographies of the members, then part of that Penn Center. And I picked up on the idea and researched on the members of our period. And we found a publisher in Germany. So that was under the title, Ach, Sie schreiben Deutsch. Oh, you're writing in German, meaning you're not in Germany, but you're writing in German. Mm-hmm. And that was a project I'm very proud of, I must say. But the end of the London experience came relatively quickly. The decision I made on the 14th of February of 99, which isn't true, 89. So I've been in Germany now for 30 years, and that says something about not being able to speak as fluently as I used to be able to, because I haven't spoken English. But this end came in December of 99.
89.
Sorry, 89, going on 99, 80. Once over. The rapid end came around the time of 89 to 90 and was relatively quick. In mid-90, I was back in Germany. And if my family hadn't helped me, I would have been in dire straits. They did. My father had died. My mother wasn't there anymore. My father had died. My brother and his family, thankfully, took me in for about 3 months until I'd found a place in Cologne where I could live. And that was the end of the English experience or the British experience during that time. Later, I came back to England quite often because of work with Penn So I could make up on lots of experiences with British people.
Okay. I mean, there are so many things that you've mentioned there that I would like to reference or speak to or speak of, but I don't think there's any point in doing so. But in other sessions, we will be able to, I think, address some of the issues that your professional decision making had an effect upon. I mean, you said yourself that you set up a Pen Writers for Women.
No, not I. No, I didn't. I was a co-founder.
A co-founder of, yes, sorry, that's what I meant. Yep, a co-founder of that project, which I would love to hear more upon. And I'm sure in our next episodes that you will really start to dig into the work that you did at Penn. And this is a fascinating story in the making. I'm happy also that you mentioned that after this experience, so how long are we talking about here? So, I mean, Cincinnati ended in 1977, so we're talking about 12 years you were in London, is that correct?
12 years in America at that point, that stretch, and 12 to 13 years in London.
Okay, all right. So I'm happy that in later years you were able to fulfill or fill in the gaps of your London experience, and I hope overcome any ill feeling that you may have had with regards to London.
I never had negative feelings about London. I loved London. It was just that I couldn't get beyond the facade, and which meant I saw London, but I didn't live in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a shame. But you also saw lots of parts of England. I mean, you have seen, let's talk about your whole life experience. You have seen lots of parts of the UK that I haven't seen. Would you agree that the UK is another classic example of a country where the capital city in no way is representative of the rest of the country?
That's very true, in the good and in the bad sense. The country is lovely. The people are very kind, but so are most of the Londoners, I must say. Mm-hmm. London is hectic. The country is slow going, is very comfortable. And as I said, beautiful. I think I spent 15 vacations in Cornwall. I loved it. We had exile friends there, and they stayed friends of mine after we had split. It was lovely to go back there alone and really enjoy the landscape and the feeling. And by that time, I'd gotten into English 19th century literature and was reading. And reading, of course, gets you into the abodes of people. Some American student once said, drama gets you into the streets of a culture. Prose gets you into the living room of culture, and poetry gets you in the heart of culture. And that is fairly true in many ways.
I think, I mean, what opens before us, and perhaps it's always been there staring me in the face, only my own silliness has allowed me to overlook it until now, is that once we have completed the life story of Karin, perhaps we can then also start to talk about your actual passion, which is literature. You can definitely educate me in so many ways upon literature, but we can perhaps talk about some of your favorites. Yes.
We can come back once I think the German experience, the next basically 20 years until I retired, we can have in one block, and then we can go into individual questions and individual parts of things that I maybe skipped about or skipped over, and you get me back into what you think is important to you to know.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I wouldn't want to concentrate your 20 years of the German return, as it were, into one episode, because I think there are lots and lots of different little chapters there, lots of different little stories. And, in fact, if we could perhaps spread them out a bit more, because, there are individuals, to whom we have in some ways referred, who themselves represent, a lot of information, a big story. I think, obviously Hrant Dink, but there's Anna Politskaya, and innumerable numbers of people with whom you have had to interact. I think they all deserve a mention. It's important to remember what these people stood for.
It's important for people who died under pressure, under persecution, I think. In other aspects, I will not talk about too many names or meetings with famous people, what have you. I'm not a name dropper. Some people are, in German, one says, in German, the term is Promi-geil, eager to get in touch with prominent people. And that is when I retreat into the background. In a way, I've always felt more comfortable in the background and have always been pushed into the front. So any chance I got back into the background.
Okay. In that way, we're perhaps quite similar, but I wouldn't want to make you feel as though you had to name drop. It just gives a certain reference point to a tale, but it also, this doesn't highlight necessarily you as the hero, but obviously you are the person who has dealt with these experiences. But you remind us of the lives that these people led. Yes. And what their trials were. And yes. That's what we want to get to, I guess.
And their courage and their kindness. Exactly. And I'm very, very privileged to have ever met them.
Yeah. So these people, from that perspective, it wouldn't be name dropping, Karin. It would simply be you giving a very honest, a sincere appraisal.
I just wanted to limit it, yes, to those. Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right. We will do that exactly the way that you want it, because I think that's the way it should be. And then after that, we could talk about some of our, and specifically yours, but some of our favorites too, because I know that we both have a particular admiration for Charles Dickens. But beyond that, also there are other, you mentioned, is it 19th century poets?
Right.
Yeah.
And writers, yes.
And writers in general. Okay. So, there is also something that I can have a small amount of input on, but would love to hear, obviously, your opinions about as well. So right. There's so much, yeah.
Once my story is over, we really get into a discussion.
Just to bring this to a conclusion, 1989, 1990, you leave London, you return to Germany at a fascinating time in German history, but not only German, but also European history, in the history of the Cold War, to open a new chapter as well in your life, which really sets us up very nicely for the next installment. Thank you, Karin. Thank you very much for your time and indeed your energy and your patience.
No, thank you. Thank you for getting it out of me. Bye-bye.